The dust clung to Wilhelmina Jenkins's black mourning dress like the town's judgment, marking her as an outcast. Outside the whitewashed church in Apache Junction, Arizona, she stood alone, her trunk by her side, as the congregation passed by without a single word or glance. The whispers of her refusal to marry Deacon Thornhill's son, a man with a shadowy past and 2 dead wives, echoed louder than the hymns drifting from the open windows. The town that had once been her home now treated her as though she were the one cursed, and all she could do was watch the doors close on the life she had known. But then a voice, rough and low, cut through the silence. "That ain't right." Wilhelmina turned quickly, startled. A man sat astride a bay horse, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He was tall, even-seated, his broad shoulders swathed in a worn leather vest. Dust coated his boots and chaps, and the sun, already high in the sky, cast shadows on his face that made it hard to see his features clearly. He seemed like he had ridden a long way. "Pardon?" she managed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice cracking from too many silent tears. The man dismounted with a practiced grace, leading his horse closer. When he pushed his hat back, she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 25 or 26, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, giving him a rugged, dangerous look, but his expression was soft, and there was something gentle in his gaze. "I said that ain't right," he repeated, nodding toward the church. "I rode in lookin' for the preacher. Heard you were his daughter. Heard what they done to you, too. Whole town's talkin' about it." Quote, Wilhelmina felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She looked away, embarrassed. "Then you know I'm not welcome here anymore." "I know they're fools," he said bluntly. "Name's Owen Armstrong. I've been ridin'. Fence for the Triple Bar Ranch up north about 20 miles. Your father wrote me 3 months ago. Said he was ailing and wanted to make sure someone would look after you if something happened to him." Her breath caught. Her father had known he was dying. The cough that had taken hold of him all spring had been worse than he'd let on. He had been making provisions for her, even as his strength faded. "My father wrote to you?" Wilhelmina asked, confusion stirring her chest. Owen reached into his vest and pulled out a letter, its creases worn soft from age. He handed it to her, and she took it with trembling hands. "He did. Said you deserved better than what this town had planned for you. Said you were a good woman and that you needed someone who would treat you right." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "Your father saved my life 5 years back. I owe him." Wilhelmina felt her throat tighten. 5 years ago, her father had been the one to pull Owen from the edge of death, an unasked-for kindness in a world full of men who needed saving. "You were 17, Owen said, as if reading her thoughts. "Stupid. Bleedin' out from a knife fight in some saloon. Your father found me, got me the doc, paid for everything. Never asked for a thing in return. Told me if I ever needed help I could come to him." Her heart twisted at the thought of her father being so selfless. "How did he know? I was in trouble," Wilhelmina whispered, the weight of grief settling back on her. Owen shifted on his feet, the silence stretching between them. "He didn't. But he saw something in me. Figured I wasn't beyond help." Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them back. Owen looked down at her trunk and then at the church doors, still shut against her. "So they threw you out for refusin' to marry some bastard you don't want?" Wilhelmina nodded bitterly. "The church council believes marriage is a duty, not a choice. They think a woman should be grateful for any offer, regardless of the man's character." "Horse shit," Owen said flatly, his words simple but full of conviction. "Begging your pardon, but that's what it is." A small laugh escaped her, surprising her. There was something about the way he said it that made her feel seen for the first time in weeks. "Your father said you were smart, kind. He said you deserve to choose your own path. That's why I'm here, to make sure you can." Owen's voice softened with sincerity. "If you're willin', I've got a place for you." Wilhelmina stared at him, her heart racing. The man who stood before her, this stranger, was offering help, offering something she hadn't even dared to dream of in the past few weeks. A choice. "I don't understand," she murmured, voice wavering. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Owen's expression softened, and he met her eyes with quiet certainty. "Your father gave me a second chance when nobody else would. I figure I owe it to him to do the same for you. Besides," he added with a slight grin, "the way I see it, you belong with people who'll treat you right. That ain't here." The simple words, spoken with such conviction, made something break loose inside her. She felt a rush of relief flood through her, but she also felt something else, something she couldn't quite name yet. Without thinking, she nodded. Yes, I'll go with you." A slow smile spread across Owen's face, transforming his features into something warmer, less rough. "Good. Let's get your trunk loaded up. We've got a ride ahead of us." He lifted her trunk with ease and secured it to his horse's saddle, showing no effort at all. When he turned back to her, he raised an eyebrow. "You know how to ride?" Quote. Wilhelmina hesitated. "My father had an old mare, but she died last year." "You can ride with me then," Owen said. "Copper here's steady. He won't mind the extra weight." Owen mounted his horse first and reached down for her. She hesitated only for a moment before she placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his skin, the strength in his grip, as he easily pulled her up behind him. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I won't bite." Quote. Wilhelmina wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the warmth of his body through his shirt, the scent of leather and sage and sun-warmed dust filling her senses. The horse began to move at an easy walk, and they rode away from the church. She stole a glance back at the building that had once been her sanctuary, now fading behind them in the distance. There was a strange mixture of grief and relief stirring inside her. "Don't look back," Owen said, his voice low and steady. "Nothing good ever comes from looking back." Wilhelmina nodded and faced forward, the road stretching ahead of them, uncertain but filled with possibility. They rode in silence for the next hour, the land around them harsh and wide, dotted with scrub brush and stretching far beneath the blue sky. She found herself relaxing, the steady rhythm of Copper's hooves lulling her into a state of calm she hadn't known in days. Owen spoke again, his voice quiet but kind. "You can talk if you want. I know you've got questions." "What's Mrs. Doyle like?" Wilhelmina asked, the only question that seemed important now. "Strong," Owen answered immediately. "Her husband died 7 years ago and left her the ranch in a mess. People told her to sell, but she dug in and made it work. She's tough, fair, and never takes any nonsense." Wilhelmina felt a flicker of hope. A woman like that, someone who could see her worth, might just be what she needed. They rode on into the day, the mountains rising in the distance, the world unfolding before her. The past was gone, but a future was waiting. The ride to the Triple Bar Ranch was long, and as the hours stretched on, Wilhelmina found herself sinking deeper into the comfort of Owen's steady presence. She barely noticed the shift in the landscape as they climbed toward higher ground. The scent of sage and wildflowers hung thick in the air, and the sun, now beginning its descent behind them, cast long shadows across the rocky terrain. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than dread. There was a quiet peace in the air, and it wrapped around her like a blanket. Owen, ever the quiet guy, didn't push her to speak. He let the silence settle between them, broken only by the soft rhythm of Copper's hooves. Wilhelmina let her thoughts wander, her fingers resting lightly on Owen's back. She didn't have to worry about her future, not right now. This ride, this moment, was all she could focus on. They passed a few scattered ranches along the way, their modest homes tucked into the corners of the land, but soon the road grew quieter. The rugged beauty of the land opened up before them, wide and free. It reminded her of the wide, open skies her father had always told her about, how they held endless possibilities, how nothing seemed out of reach. As they approached a rocky hill, Owen broke the silence. "It's not far now." Wilhelmina nodded, her throat dry. "I'm not sure what to expect. Mrs. Doyle's a good woman, tough but fair. You'll fit right in." She doesn't tolerate weakness, but she'll give you a chance." Owen's voice had a note of respect that made her feel a little lighter. If he respected Mrs. Doyle, then she had a good chance of finding a place there. Wilhelmina glanced at him, her gaze lingering on the quiet intensity of his profile. "You think so?" "I know so." Owen turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with that same look of unwavering certainty. "You've got more strength in you than half the men I've worked with. Mrs. Doyle will see that." Wilhelmina didn't know what to say to that. She had been told her whole life what she was supposed to be. Obedient, docile, a woman who kept her head down and her mouth shut. But the men she had seen in her life, her father included, had taught her something else. That strength wasn't about being silent. Strength was in standing firm for what you believed in, even if it meant standing alone. Owen's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mrs. Doyle's ranch is tough work, but it's honest. You'll find your place there, I'm sure of it." As they crested the hill, the site of the ranch appeared in the distance, framed by the purple shadows of the mountains. It was smaller than she'd expected, but it had an undeniable presence. The adobe buildings gleamed in the last light of the day, their red-tiled roofs standing out against the dry, desert backdrop. The fence lines stretched far in every direction, and the cattle were grazing lazily, unaware of the new arrivals. They slowed as they approached the ranch gate, and Wilhelmina's heart skipped in her chest. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side of that gate. She only knew that everything had led her here. Owen didn't speak as he dismounted, gently guiding Copper toward the hitching post. He took her trunk and led her toward the porch of the main house where a woman stood waiting. Wilhelmina's breath caught. The woman was tall, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face, weathered by years of sun and wind, was sharp and commanding, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made Wilhelmina feel immediately welcome. She was dressed simply, in a dark dress that looked as if it had seen its fair share of hard work, but there was something undeniably regal about her presence. "This is Miss Wilhelmina Jenkins," Owen said, his voice quieter now. "Miss Jenkins? This is Mrs. Catherine Doyle." Wilhelmina took a deep breath and offered a steady smile, holding out her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Doyle." Mrs. Doyle studied her for a moment before reaching out to shake her hand, her grip firm and confident. "You must be tired after that long ride. Come in, I'll get you settled, and then we'll get you something to eat." The invitation was simple, but Wilhelmina felt the weight of it. It wasn't just hospitality. It was acceptance, something she hadn't felt in far too long. As they stepped inside, Wilhelmina was struck by how different the house felt from the one she had grown up in. It was cooler, darker, the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread mixing in the air. Everything was sturdy and practical. Wooden beams in the ceiling, simple furniture with a weathered charm. It felt like a place where people worked hard, but it was still a home. Mrs. Doyle led her down a hallway and opened a door to a small but cozy room. "This will be yours for now," she said. "Not much, but it's yours." Quote, Wilhelmina stepped inside, her chest tight. It was a simple room, a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, but it was a room with a door that closed, a place where she could find some peace. She set her trunk down and looked around. There was no one else here, no expectations hanging over her, no pressure to be someone she wasn't. It was a start. Mrs. Doyle gave her a moment before speaking again. "I'll bring you something to eat. Owen's been talking about your cooking. If he says you're any good, I'll be glad to have you help with meals." Wilhelmina's heart skipped. Owen had mentioned her cooking? The thought was almost enough to make her smile. She was good at it, thanks to her mother's careful lessons, but she never thought it was something worth mentioning. "I'll do my best," she said, feeling suddenly shy. Mrs. Doyle raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you will." With that, she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Wilhelmina stood in the room, her fingers brushing the cool wood of the dresser, the reality of it sinking in. She had a bed, a roof, and a place to belong. It was a far cry from the rejection she had faced in Apache Junction. She walked to the window, looking out at the wide expanse of the ranch. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shrouded in the last light of the evening. She breathed deeply, feeling the air fill her lungs. This land, This life, she wasn't sure what to expect, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. There were still questions in her heart, still worries about the future. But for now, she was safe, she was here. And maybe that was enough. Dinner that evening was quiet but comfortable. The men, who had gathered around the long wooden table, ate with single-minded focus, the clatter of forks and knives punctuating the steady rhythm of the night. Wilhelmina stood by the stove, watching them as she worked, her hands moving with the practiced grace her mother had instilled in her. There was something comforting about the routine, frying the bacon, stirring the beans, setting the table with the same care her mother would have taken. But here, at the Triple Bar, it felt different. It felt like a new chapter, and she had no idea yet how this story would unfold. Owen had been the first to sit, his usual ease making him fit right in with the others. But as she moved around the table, setting out more food, she couldn't help but notice how often his gaze flickered toward her. It wasn't the casual, disinterested glances the other men gave her, nor the dismissive look she had received in Apache Junction. His gaze was steady, appreciative. There was something in the way he watched her that made her heart skip, though she did her best to ignore it. Mrs. Doyle was at the far end of the table, as commanding as always, her sharp eyes taking in everything with a mixture of concern and authority. Her strong opinions were tempered by kindness, though, and Wilhelmina found herself grateful for that. The meal passed quietly, the men talking about the day's work, their voices low and familiar. Wilhelmina found herself listening to the rhythm of their words, the camaraderie that filled the room. It was different from what she had known, but there was something about it that felt right. She had always helped her father with the ranching, but it had never been this kind of community, this constant exchange of words, of ideas, of work that had a steady purpose behind it. Owen, for his part, spoke less than he had on the ride, though there was an easygoing nature to the way he interacted with the others. He would smile when one of the hands made a joke, but he didn't offer much of himself. She had to remind herself that this was just the way he was, quiet, reserved, but strong in his actions. It wasn't his words that mattered, it was his presence. After dinner, the men dispersed, heading off to their chores or to the bunkhouse for a night's rest. Owen stayed behind, helping Mrs. Doyle with the dishes. Wilhelmina, busy cleaning the counters, tried not to look at him, but her eyes kept drifting in his direction. She knew she was being silly, but there was something about him that made her heart ache in a way she couldn't understand. She had barely known him a day, but somehow he had slipped under her defenses without even trying. "You're doing well," Mrs. Doyle said, breaking the silence as she wiped the last of the dishes. "Better than I expected." Wilhelmina looked up, startled. "I'm just trying to keep up." "You're doing more than that," Mrs. Doyle said, her voice softening. "You've got a quiet strength about you, Miss Jenkins. I can see why your father trusted you." The words caught Wilhelmina off guard. She had never really thought of herself as strong, especially not in the way her father had been. He had been the rock of their little community, the one who could always be relied upon. But now, standing here in the dim kitchen light, Wilhelmina wasn't so sure of her own strength. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I'm just trying to find my place," Wilhelmina admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Mrs. Doyle gave her a long, assessing look, and for a moment, Wilhelmina thought she might say something harsh, something critical. But instead, Mrs. Neve booed. Doyle simply nodded, as if she understood exactly what Wilhelmina meant. "You'll find it," she said softly. "It may not come easily, but you'll find your place here." Before Wilhelmina could respond, Mrs. Doyle stood up and moved to the back door. "It's been a long day for all of us. You'll need your rest." Wilhelmina nodded, though a part of her wasn't quite ready to retreat to her small room just yet. She wanted to stay here, to be a part of the rhythm of the ranch, to feel as if she were needed. But Mrs. Doyle was right. She needed to rest. Tomorrow would be another long day. As she headed up the stairs to her room, she could feel the weight of the night pressing in on her. The uncertainty, the fear of the unknown, still lingered like a shadow just behind her thoughts. But she was here, wasn't she? She had a roof over her head, food on the table, and a job that, while difficult, had a purpose. That was more than she had ever had in Apache Junction. She sat down on the edge of the bed, letting out a long breath. It had been a long day. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she felt as though it might bring something good. The next morning, she was up before the sun, helping Mrs. Doyle prepare breakfast. The other men were already beginning their work as the first light of dawn broke over the land, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. There was a quiet beauty in the way the ranch came to life with the rising sun, and Wilhelmina found herself appreciating it, despite the exhaustion that still weighed on her bones. After breakfast, she went to work with the other women who had come to help with the housework. Mrs. Doyle had promised her that once she got settled, she would teach her how to manage the ranch's accounts, but for now, there was plenty of cooking and cleaning to keep her busy. Wilhelmina was grateful for that. The work was tiring, but it was honest, and it kept her mind occupied. As the day wore on, she found herself beginning to relax into the routine of the place. She began to understand the rhythm of the work, the quiet chatter of the men as they went about their tasks, and the steady presence of Mrs. Doyle, always keeping everything running smoothly. By late afternoon, after the day's work was done, she found herself back on the porch with Owen. The heat of the day had finally begun to dissipate, and the cool breeze brought relief after hours in the sun. "You settling in all right?" Owen asked, looking at her with that steady gaze of his. Wilhelmina hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She wasn't sure if "all right" was the word for how she felt, but she knew it was better than she had expected. "Better than I thought I would," she admitted. "It's different here, but it feels like it could be, enough." "Good," Owen said simply. He was quiet for a moment before adding, "You'll do fine here. You've got the right kind of spirit." Wilhelmina glanced at him, unsure of what to say. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel exposed, but also understood. It was more than just respect, more than just politeness. It was something deeper. "Thank you, Owen," she said quietly, her voice softer than she had meant. He gave a small nod, as if her words meant something to him. They sat in companionable silence as the last light of day slowly faded into night. And for the first time in a long time, Wilhelmina allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found her place. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Each morning, Wilhelmina woke before the sun, eager to begin the day's work. Mrs. Doyle had shown her the ins and outs of running the household, but it was clear that she still had much to learn. The ranch hands, though silent and focused, became familiar in their own way. The younger ones, like Tommy and Billy, were easy to work with, their eyes always full of respect. But the older ones, men like Jack and Pete, were more distant, nodding at her but never saying much. It made her wonder if they saw her as an outsider, or if they simply didn't know how to deal with a woman in charge of their meals. Still, the silence didn't feel like rejection, just an unspoken understanding that things were different here. Wilhelmina didn't mind. In fact, she was grateful for it. She had never been one for crowds or constant conversation. Here, she could work, focus, and be left to herself when she needed to be. The evenings were the hardest part. After dinner, when the ranch hands would gather in the bunkhouse for cards or a round of whiskey, she would often sit on the porch, her eyes turned to the wide, empty landscape, the stars burning bright overhead. The isolation of the ranch was a constant reminder of how far she had come, how much had changed. There was no going back to the life she had known, and a part of her was still struggling to accept that. But at the same time, there was peace here, in the quiet, in the steady rhythm of the days. One evening, after the hands had finished their dinner and the ranch house was quiet again, Owen joined her on the porch. It had been a long day, and she was tired, her muscles aching from the constant work. She looked up to find him standing there, a half smile tugging at his lips, his hat in hand. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low, the familiar roughness in it that Wilhelmina had come to find comforting. "Of course not," she replied, moving over to make room for him. He sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the night air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the sound of the wind in the trees, the rustling of the grass in the fields, the faint calls of the coyotes in the distance. "I like it out here," Owen said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "Me too," Wilhelmina said quietly. "It's different than I expected. I thought I'd feel more alone, I guess, but it's peaceful." "Yeah, it's a quiet kind of peace," Owen agreed. "A good kind of quiet." Wilhelmina nodded. "I didn't expect to find that here. I thought this place would be just more work, more labor. But there's something about it, something in the land, the sky, that makes it feel different." Owen glanced at her, his gaze soft. "You've got a way with words, Wilhelmina." She felt the compliment warm her cheeks, though she wasn't sure how to respond. Instead, she simply smiled and turned her gaze back to the horizon, her hands resting in her lap. "I'm glad you're here," Owen added quietly, as if the words had slipped out without him meaning to say them. But once they were spoken, he didn't seem to regret them. "Thank you," Wilhelmina said, her voice soft. "It's strange, isn't it? How life can change so quickly." He nodded. "Yeah, 1 minute, you're lost, and the next, you're found." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She turned toward him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. There was something in his expression, something steady and real, that made her breath catch. "I don't know if I'll ever truly fit in here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm trying. I'm trying to make it work." "You'll fit," Owen said with certainty. "You already have. This place, it's not just about the land, Wilhelmina. It's about the people. And you belong with us." Quote. Her chest tightened at his words, the warmth in his voice, a comfort she hadn't realized she needed until that moment. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she truly had a place here, among these people, in this life. But the doubt still lingered, a shadow in the back of her mind that whispered, "What if they only tolerate you? What if you're not enough?" The night stretched on, but neither of them spoke much more after that. The quiet between them was comfortable, almost companionable. Owen, for all his quiet nature, had a way of making her feel like she wasn't alone, and that was something she hadn't felt in a long time. As the night deepened, Wilhelmina stood, brushing the dirt from her skirts. "I should be getting to bed," she said. "It'll be another early morning tomorrow." Owen stood too, a slight grin on his face. "You're turning into a real ranch woman." She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "I'm just trying to keep up." "You're doing more than that," Owen said, his voice warm with admiration, "and you always will." Quote. With that, he tipped his hat to her, his eyes lingering for a moment longer before he turned to head toward the bunkhouse. Wilhelmina watched him go, her heart beating a little faster than before. She was still unsure about everything, about the ranch, about the people, about herself. But with every passing day, she found herself feeling more at home. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her here. The next morning, she woke early, as usual, and made her way to the kitchen, ready to begin the day's work. There was a peace in the routine, a rhythm that had settled into her bones. The steady pace of ranch life had become something she depended on. Mrs. Doyle was already in the kitchen, preparing for breakfast as usual. She looked up as Wilhelmina entered and smiled. "You're starting to settle in well," Mrs. Doyle observed, setting a pan on the stove. Wilhelmina nodded, her smile soft. "I think so." "I know it's been a hard transition," Mrs. Doyle said, her tone softer than usual. "But you're stronger than you know." Quote. Wilhelmina glanced at her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said quietly, feeling the warmth of the older woman's words sink in. Mrs. Doyle gave a small nod. "It's not easy what you're doing, but it's worth it." The words hung in the air as they both moved to their tasks, the sounds of the morning becoming familiar in the space between them. Wilhelmina felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in a long time, as if, despite all the uncertainty, she had found something here. A place, a purpose, and a man who, whether she admitted it or not, had already begun to fill the empty spaces in her heart. The weeks that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. Wilhelmina had found a rhythm at the Triple Bar, a life that felt steady and familiar, even if it was a world she had never imagined herself living in. She worked alongside Mrs. Doyle, preparing meals for the hands, keeping the house in order, and learning the ins and outs of ranch life. She had grown accustomed to the wide, unending stretches of land that seemed to go on forever, and the steady hum of ranch work that kept everything moving. She had begun to feel like part of it, though it was still a quiet, distant sort of belonging. But it was a start. One afternoon, just as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Wilhelmina found herself standing on the porch again, looking out across the ranch. The air was cool for a change, the heat of the day finally giving way to the crisp breath of evening. She had just finished preparing dinner and was waiting for the men to return from the fields. There was a familiar weight in the air, one she had learned to recognize: tension. The rustlers hadn't stopped. The Triple Bar had been dealing with their petty attacks for weeks now, and each day seemed to bring a new, quiet threat. She had heard talk of it over the past few days, how the men were growing restless, how Mrs. Doyle's patience was beginning to wear thin. Yet despite all the murmurs, nothing had been done. No one had been caught. No one had made a move to stop the thieves, and it left the ranch in a constant state of unease. She didn't notice Owen's approach until he was standing beside her, his presence a quiet, constant thing she had grown accustomed to. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to her, his gaze following hers as they both watched the horizon. The mountains were dark against the purple sky, their jagged edges catching the last bits of sunlight. "You've been quiet today," Wilhelmina said, her voice soft. Owen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long breath, his shoulders lifting and falling in the evening air. He looked tired, but there was something else in his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just the physical exhaustion of ranch life. "I'm always quiet," he said finally, a half smile tugging at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "But yeah, I've been thinking." Wilhelmina didn't have to ask about what. She could see it in his face, the way his brow furrowed with every passing thought, the way his jaw clenched when he was trying to keep his anger in check. It was the same look he had worn the night he'd first spoken to the rustlers, when everything had started to escalate. "Do you think it'll ever end?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Owen's eyes slid over to her, his gaze softer now, though the weight of what they were facing was still heavy between them. "I hope it will," he said, his voice low. "But that don't mean I think it will, anytime soon." They stood there in silence, the world stretched out before them, both of them lost in thoughts of what could be. It had been a long, hard road for both of them. For Wilhelmina, the fear of losing everything had been replaced by the fear of what might happen to the people she had come to care for, the people who had given her a second chance. She couldn't lose that, not after everything she had been through to get here. "I don't know what to do about it," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Owen turned to face her fully now, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. His hand reached out, resting on her shoulder with a warmth that felt solid, as if he could anchor her to something that wasn't drifting in the wind. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "We've handled worse. We'll handle this." His words were simple, but there was a quiet strength in them that made her believe him. Even in the midst of all the uncertainty, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. Owen was right. They had faced worse, and they were still here, still standing. Before she could say anything else, the sound of hooves interrupted them. They both turned, Wilhelmina's heart leaping in her chest as she saw the men riding toward the ranch, dust trailing behind them. Owen's hand dropped from her shoulder, and he stepped forward, his body tense, his focus sharp. "They're back," he murmured. She nodded, her eyes tracking the group of riders as they approached the house. She could see the fatigue in their posture, the way they rode with their heads down, as if the weight of the day's work had taken everything out of them. But she could also see the hard lines on their faces, the seriousness that had taken hold of them as the days had gone on. When they dismounted, Wilhelmina could see the tension in their movements. The ranch hands were no longer the easygoing, relaxed men they had once been. They were different now, more watchful, more guarded. They were living with the constant threat of the rustlers, and it had begun to take its toll. Owen stepped forward to meet them, his expression grave as he spoke to the men. Wilhelmina stayed by the porch, her heart in her throat as she waited to hear what had happened. She watched as Owen exchanged a few quick words with the men before he turned to Mrs. Doyle, his face darkening. "More of the same," Owen said as he approached her. "Another herd gone. A few more fences cut. It's like they're testing us, seeing how far they can push before we break." Mrs. Doyle's face was hard as stone, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded once, as if to herself. "We'll ride out again tomorrow," Owen continued. "We need to find them before they do more damage." Wilhelmina's heart sank at the thought. She had seen the men go out before, and she had known the danger they faced. But the idea of them being out there, exposed, vulnerable to whatever the rustlers might do next, it made her chest tighten. "Please be careful," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Owen glanced at her, his gaze softening for just a moment. "I will," he promised, his voice low. "I always am." It was a promise he didn't need to make, but she appreciated it all the same. There was a kind of reassurance in his presence, in the steadiness of his words. She had come to rely on it, just as she had begun to rely on him. The men went inside to eat, their movements slow and deliberate. Wilhelmina followed them, but her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what they were facing. She couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep up this fight, how much longer they could hold on before the rustlers pushed too far. And yet, as she glanced over at Owen, standing by the door with that same quiet determination on his face, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and hope, each day marked by the unspoken promise of change hanging in the air. The rustlers were growing bolder, but so were the men of the Triple Bar. Each morning they saddled their horses with grim determination, prepared for whatever came next. But still, the threat loomed, unseen, elusive. The quiet of the ranch was shattered only by the occasional call of the hands as they worked, or the steady rhythm of hooves on the earth. Wilhelmina felt the weight of it all, the sense that something big was coming, but she couldn't tell what. One afternoon, the sun was setting in a burst of orange and red when she found herself standing in the same spot as before, looking out over the land. The mountains loomed in the distance, their purple shadows stretching over the hills. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Wilhelmina took a deep breath, feeling the peace that only a moment of stillness could bring. But it was fleeting, replaced by the ever-present worry gnawing at her insides. "You're quiet again." Owen's voice broke through the silence. He had come up behind her, his presence warm but steady. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking." "About?" She turned to face him, meeting his gaze. "About what happens next." Owen stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We'll keep going, like we always have," he said, his voice steady, filled with the calm assurance that had kept them both grounded in the chaos of the last few weeks. "We'll protect what's ours. We've done it before, and we'll do it again." She nodded, though doubt lingered in her chest. The land stretched out before them, vast and untamed, and it felt like the world was closing in, pressing them into a corner with every passing day. The next morning, just before dawn, Owen mounted his horse, his rifle slung across his back. Wilhelmina stood at the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him. The men were preparing to leave, as they had countless times before, but this time, something felt different. This time, they were taking action, not just defending themselves, but preparing for the final confrontation. "You'll be back soon?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an underlying urgency. Owen turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "We'll find them today, Wilhelmina. I promise." She nodded, though her heart was heavy. There was something in his voice, something in the way he looked at her, that made her wonder if this might be the last time she saw him ride out. But she didn't speak the words aloud, didn't let the fear take root. Instead, she stood there, watching him until he disappeared over the horizon, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Hours passed in tense silence. Mrs. Doyle had retreated to the house to manage things, leaving Wilhelmina alone with her thoughts. She kept herself busy, working in the kitchen, trying to shake the gnawing sense of dread. It was nearly sunset when the men returned, their faces grim, their bodies worn from the long ride. Owen dismounted, his face dark with frustration. Wilhelmina's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. He was fine, just tired and dirty, but there was something else in his eyes, a storm brewing behind the calm facade. "They're gone," Owen said, his voice tight. "But we found their tracks. We know where they're headed." Wilhelmina's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" "It means we go after them," Owen replied. "We end this, once and for all." The words settled over her like a weight. She felt her throat tighten, but she nodded. It had to end. It couldn't go on forever. By the time the men had rested and prepared for the final push, it was dark. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the land. Wilhelmina stood by the porch, waiting, her heart pounding. Owen had insisted she stay behind, that it was too dangerous. But she knew him too well. She knew he wouldn't come back until it was finished. And she couldn't just sit and wait. She grabbed her rifle, securing it to the saddle of a nearby horse. Mrs. Doyle tried to stop her, but Wilhelmina's resolve was firm. She couldn't let Owen face this alone, not after everything they had been through. The men were already mounted when she rode up beside them. Owen didn't say anything at first, just gave her a look, part surprise, part concern. But he didn't argue. He knew her too well. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, and they rode off into the night. The ride felt endless. They followed the tracks, weaving through the hills and canyons until they came upon a secluded valley. The rustlers had made camp there, their fires still burning low in the shadows. The men dismounted, moving silently, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Owen looked at Wilhelmina, giving her a nod. She nodded back, her heart racing. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. They moved in, quick and quiet, surrounding the camp from all sides. The confrontation was swift. The rustlers were caught off guard, and in the chaos that followed, the men of the Triple Bar fought back with everything they had. Bullets flew, shouts echoed in the night, but in the end, it was over. The rustlers were captured, their plans thwarted. Owen, his face grim but relieved, turned to Wilhelmina after the dust had settled. "It's done," he said simply, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. Wilhelmina exhaled, the weight of it all lifting off her shoulders. She couldn't help but smile, though the adrenaline was still rushing through her veins. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Owen stepped closer, his expression softening. "I said I would." With the rustlers taken care of, and the danger finally behind them, the world seemed to settle back into its rhythm. The ranch was safe, and Wilhelmina had the sense that, at last, they could breathe easy. A week later, after the men had finished their work and the rustlers had been turned over to the law, Owen took her hand one evening, just as the sun began to set over the ranch. "Wilhelmina," he began, his voice steady, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She looked at him, her heart leaping in her chest. "What is it?" Quote, Owen paused for a moment, his eyes locking onto hers, full of intensity. "I don't want to live without you. Will you marry me?" For the first time in what felt like forever, Wilhelmina's heart soared. She had never imagined this moment, not like this, but now that it was here, it felt like the only thing that mattered. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." And with that, their world shifted once more. They stood together, hand in hand, watching the sky turn a deep shade of blue, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Together, they had built a life worth living, one of love, trust, and second chances. And in that moment, it was all they needed,